They're teaching people a new way of seeing the world and a new way of thinking about acting in the world. And seeing and thinking and acting in the world, those are pretty powerful things. That's a kind of personal transformation. In this episode, I talk with Amy Climer about my new book. It's called Learning to See: Inside the World's Leading Art and Design Schools. It's a book for everyone who's interested in art and design. I interviewed 100 artists and designers in over 20 creative fields. My goal was to get at the underlying essence that's shared across the visual arts. I wanted to find out how artists and designers work in their own professional practice, but also how they teach the next generation of artists and designers in BFA and MFA programs. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the podcast, and I hope you'll leave a review because it helps people like you find out about the science of creativity. Now, here's our interview.
I am delighted to join you, Keith, on your own podcast, The Science of Creativity. I'm here to interview Keith about his new book, Learning to See: Inside the World's Leading Art and Design Schools. Keith, thank you so much for inviting me to the show.
Oh, and thank you. I'm really excited about this conversation.
So when you started doing the research that led to this new book, you did not set out to teach people how to see. So I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about what were those initial questions that you were asking way back, 15 years ago when you first started doing this research?
I'm a psychologist and I study creativity. So that's what I thought I'd be doing. I'm going to study how people learn to be creative. Around 2006 to 2009, I shifted my creativity research to focus on teaching and learning for creativity. Then I realized, if anyone knows how to teach for creativity, it's going to be professors in art schools and professors in design schools. They're going to be the ones teaching creativity, right?
It makes sense.
I myself have not been to art or design school. So I just had this assumption and I said, I'm going to make this new project called Learning How to Create. And I'm going to go interview art professors and design professors, and they're going to tell me how they teach students how to create. So the first interview I did, and I started with my interview script, and I said, how do you teach people how to be creative? And the professor was very uncomfortable. Her name was Sandra Reed, professor of painting at Savannah College of Art and Design. And she said, she's trying to be polite, I don't think I'm doing that. And, as a good anthropologist, I said, well, what are you doing then? And that's when the conversation took off.
Okay, this is fascinating. I have so many questions just from that one thing. First, why art and design schools? So you touched on that a little bit, but what were the assumptions you were going in that kind of got blown out of the water a little bit? But what were the assumptions you had about art and design schools?
Oh, that's a great question, because in my own creativity research, I often am critical of what I think of as the myth of the brilliant artist, and the artist is the pinnacle of creativity, because in my research, everyone has that creative potential, and it's not unique to artists, and it's not unique to gifted creative professionals. So it's not that I stereotypically thought these artists are the pinnacle of creativity, but I thought that's a big part of art, that you would have to be creative to make art. So that was my starting assumption anyway, that they're maybe not more creative than everybody else. Scientists are creative, engineers are creative, we're all creative in our everyday life. But no, there's no question that a painter would be creative. So yeah, I didn't go to art school. I haven't taken a painting class, so I didn't know what would happen, but I just assumed something going on in there would have to do with creativity. And that's true. And in fact, my book, Learning to See, has a lot about being creative and learning to be creative. But that's not what these painters told me. And that's not what they say they're doing. What they are doing, I think, is something more profound. They're teaching people a new way of seeing the world and a new way of thinking about acting in the world. And seeing and thinking and acting in the world, those are pretty powerful things. That's a kind of personal transformation. So I once I learned that, and that was in the first couple of interviews, and then I did 100 interviews total over years and years, and this came up over and over again. This theme of teaching students how to see and think, and I thought that's really compelling. That's really powerful. That's in some ways more powerful than creativity, and that's why I ended up calling my book "Learning to See." As
Mm.
a matter of fact, I was going to call it Learning How to Create. And I was telling the people I interviewed, oh, yeah, I'm doing this project and I'm going to write a book called Learning How to Create. And everyone was horrified. They're like, no, 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 don't call it that. Don't say creativity.
It's so
Because they
funny.
just really were, uncomfortable with the word creativity. Don't put creativity in the title of the book. So, what are they teaching? Yeah, they're teaching people how to see.
This is so interesting, and we're going to unpack more about how to see and what you learned. But I want to go back to that first conversation you had, that first interview. You had several more interviews, and you talk about these in the book, where the professors really pushed back about creativity. And then it sounds like even to the point where they were begging you not to put that word in the title of the book. Yet here you are
Right.
as a psychologist who studies creativity. So I'm just curious, can you go back to those early interviews? What were you thinking? What was going through your head when you heard these professors saying, oh, no, 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 I don't teach creativity. In fact, I don't even use the word creativity when I'm talking to my students. Like, what were you thinking?
Well, as a matter of fact, they're a little bit, I don't know if angry is the right word, but they're upset by the concept of creativity because now imagine these are successful professional painters and they're teaching in an art school. So they're the kind of people who, people have been telling them they're creative since they were 6 years old. Then they were 10 years old and then they went to art school themselves. And so they meet people at parties. Oh, you're a painter. You must be creative. I think what their experience has been that people think that creativity is easy for them. So they
Ah,
became painters because it was something easy for them. And they perceive it in a way almost as demeaning, like,
mhm.
oh, you're a creative person. So painting is easy for you. And that's why you became a painter. And they would say, no, painting is hard. Doing painting the right way, it's hard. It's not easy for anyone. And it's not easy for me either. So when someone calls them creative, to them, it almost seems as if they're saying, it's easy for you. It's just
Mm.
something that you know how to do because you were born as a painter. And that's absolutely not the case. Painting, in a way, might be harder for a painter than it is for the rest of us.
That is such an interesting. That makes so much sense, and I think that that's a real myth that we hold in our society about creativity is that it's easy for the people that are quote unquote creatives, that it must be easy for them. But I think what you found, and I've certainly seen in my life, is that being creative is work. In fact, if that's probably one of the reasons why people often resist it, because it's like, oh, wait, I got to put all this work in. Like, yeah, just like anything else, right?
Yeah, it's this notion that you write about as well, this notion of deliberate creativity. And I was fascinated that that's in the title of your recent book as well, because I had a lot of these artists and designers both when they're talking about what they're teaching their students. They say, I'm teaching them a deliberate process.
Yeah,
I'm saying, you're going to be a professional. You're going to have to create every day and every month for the rest of your life. You can't wait for inspiration to hit you. You can't wait for an insight. That's not how to have a professional, successful, creative life. They say, I'm teaching them a deliberate process that consistently leads to successful creative outcomes.
absolutely. I love that that came out because that's what I've seen in my research and my work, and it really dispels the myth that creativity is just gonna pop in our head and it's this amazing moment. It's like, not really. It's much harder than that, and it comes through process, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But before we get into the process of creativity and art, tell us about the research process that you went through. You just said you interviewed 100 people and this research spanned over 15 years, but tell us a bit more. Give us the storyline of that research.
That's a great question. And I don't think I've told that story before. What happened was I was a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and I had an opportunity for a sabbatical leave where Washington University would let me take a semester off. And what am I going to do for my semester off? I had an invitation from Savannah College of Art and Design. They said, "Oh, Keith Sawyer, he's a creativity researcher. Let's have him come here and, work with our faculty and see what he can bring to SCAD, Savannah College of Art and Design." So that was spring of 2010. And frankly, half the reason I agreed was because I really liked the city of Savannah. It's
That
so
does help.
charming. My wife loved it. She said, "Oh, yeah, that would be great to live in Savannah for 6 months." And it was only after I got there that I had the idea of interviewing people. I actually didn't go there with the intention of interviewing artists and designers and figuring out how they taught. But I was, the first month there, I was in some studio classes and I was fascinated by this compelling teaching process and the studio activities of the students in the class. I'd never seen anything like that. Like I said, I hadn't been to art school myself. And that's where I got the idea to start interviewing them. It really was serendipitous that I ended up starting doing these interviews.
Okay, so you started doing these interviews, and there was a bit more to it, though. There were some themes that evolved, and you used a process called grounded theory. Is that right?
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So I am a psychologist and I like to think I'm doing rigorous scientific research and not just, telling stories like a newspaper reporter, perhaps. I mean, people who write in newspapers, they interview artists and they write stories about art shows or whatever. And that wasn't my intent because I do have these rigorous methodologies that I use. So I did a lot of interviews, and that's similar to what, a reporter might do or an art critic might do.
Mm-hmm.
But I got lots and lots of interviews. Whereas if you were writing a news story, you probably only do one interview or maybe two interviews.
Yep.
And I ended up, after I left SCAD, I went to other universities around the country. I went to the School of Visual Arts in New York City. I went to California Institute of the Arts, or Cal Arts, in Los Angeles. Then I went to Chicago, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And the reason why I went to all of these different places is because I wanted to identify the underlying shared essence of what goes on in art and design schools. I didn't want to tell the story of just one painting professor or even of just one campus. But then once you've done all these interviews, I had 100 interviews, then what do you do with all that, right? How do you tease out the underlying essence? I mean, I could just sit in an armchair and think really hard about it and say, this is what I think the underlying essence is. But I used a methodology that allows a researcher to go through a huge mass of data, interview data, in this case, and studio classroom observations, going through this huge mass of stuff, thousands and thousands of pages of transcriptions of this material, and then sifting through that through a rigorous process called grounded theory methodology, which in my book, Learning to See, I left that out. I wanted a book that was accessible to every reader. So I didn't want to have a big section where I bore people with my tedious methodology. But because I am an experienced researcher and I know these rigorous methodologies, what I say in my book, I believe really does get at the core truth of what's going on in the studio classrooms.
And what was your initial research question? Because it wasn't about learning to see.
That's right. It was about teaching and learning how to be creative because, like I said, I'm a creativity researcher. I've been doing it for a long time. So I started this in 2010. But even before that, I had written a book called Explaining Creativity. I'd written a book called Group Genius and another book called Group Creativity. That's where you and I became familiar with each other because you study teams and groups as well. And I played piano. I was a jazz pianist. I performed with Chicago improvisational theater groups where I would be the improvising pianist on the side of the stage
Nice.
while the action was going on stage. And I wrote 2 books about Chicago improvisational theater. And all of that happened before I showed up at the Savannah College of Art and Design. and not having been to art and design school myself. So I was intrigued. I was like, hey, I know about jazz creativity. I know about improv theater creativity. I've written a textbook about creativity, but I don't know what happens in art and design school. So, in a way, it was kind of rounding out my experience of a variety of creative domains.
I love it. And it feels like that, you went in with this one question about teaching and learning creativity, but instead you emerged with this completely different answer that maybe had a little bit connected to that initial question, but was not at all what you expected. Is that right?
You're right. Like this very first interview where Sandra said, I don't think I'm doing that. And then I basically had to pivot and change the whole. I had, an interview script like a good researcher. I had all these questions I was going to ask. And then the first question, went, I was going to say went wrong, but it just went in a different direction. So I ended up tossing out my questions and I said, well, you tell me, what is it that you're doing?
Yeah.
And what they are doing is a lot more, I don't know if I'd say complicated or subtle, but then imagine when you're out there listening, what does it mean to see? And how is that different? I mean, we all see, we all look at things. So, what does it mean to teach someone how to see or learn how to see? And that's something I had never thought about, right? It doesn't come up in jazz improvisation, or it's not something that happens on an improvisational theater stage. So, in all of my creativity research, I'd never heard anyone say it's about learning to see in a new way. And
Mm-hmm.
that was just so powerful for me. I was like, wow. So, what is that? What are you teaching people how to see? How do you do that? And then I would say, I'm an education researcher. Like, can you just give a lecture or,
Right.
PowerPoint slides? Here's how to see. And everyone said, well, I only asked that two questions. I only asked that in two interviews because, everyone said, oh, they didn't say that's a dumb question, but they would say, no, that doesn't work. You can't just tell someone how to see in a different way. And then, well, again, I said, well, how do you teach people how to do that? How long does it take? If you get a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree, you start your classes in your first year and then you go to art school for 4 years. So, does it really take 4 years? And I actually asked that question trying to be polite, right? But does it really take 4 years? And yeah, they said the students don't even get close until 2 years, at
Yeah.
least 2 years. And that's like the absolute minimum. But really, they say it really does take 4 years.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I don't have an art degree, but I've taken a lot of college level art classes. Like when I was in my master's program, I found out, oh, I only needed to take 9 credits, but I got 12 credits for free. So I just added on an art class every semester, or some other class. And when I worked at University of Wisconsin, I was like, oh, I could take a class for free. Well, actually, no, it wasn't free, but it's very cheap.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I took a bunch of art classes. In fact, the only time in my entire education career that I stayed up almost till morning was because of an art class. I stayed up till 3 in the morning working on a project because it's not like you could hit save and just turn it in. It's like it's done or not. So one of the things I was struck in, when you're talking about like you went in with this question about teaching and learning creativity, but then what you really came out with was learning to see. It reminded me of this parallel of one of your teachers, Dr. Csikszentmihalyi, who was your dissertation chair, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mike Csikszentmihalyi.
Yeah. And I mean, amazing, one of the top creativity researchers of our time. And when he discovered the concepts of flow, that was not what he went in to learn. He was studying creativity. And then what emerged was that, oh, wow, when we're in the creative state, we're often in the state of flow where time slips away, we're completely engrossed in what we're doing. And I just thought that was a really cool parallel and really a nod to you that you just kind of went where the research took you to see what would happen. And I think that's can be a really important part of the research process. So I just thought that was really cool.
Oh, absolutely. And I think a lot of people don't know that Mike Csikszentmihalyi's PhD dissertation at University of Chicago was the study of painters.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
it's the University of Chicago where he got his PhD, same place as me. So he became a professor also at University of Chicago, but he did his PhD thesis there as well. And School of the Art Institute of Chicago, also in Chicago, SAIC. So he went to painting professors and painting classes for his PhD dissertation. He studied MFA students getting their master's degree in fine arts in painting, and he focused on their creative process. He did a couple of not really experiments, but some structured activities
Hmm.
where he would be able to observe them while they were engaged in the painting process, and then to be able to finish in an hour. So he could study the entire process from beginning to end. And, fascinating because I came full circle because one of the places I went to for my interviews was the School of the Art Institute of Chicago.
I love
Same
it.
place he got his PhD. And, it's one of the top art schools in the country. And yeah, kind of following in Csikszentmihalyi's footsteps, I guess. You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. If you're enjoying the episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and rate the show and leave a comment because it helps people like you find the show. You can find The Science of Creativity on all podcast platforms.
That's awesome. I love the full circle aspect. So let's get into some of these themes that you found through your research. Actually, one more question before we do that. Who did you write this book for?
I wrote the book for artists and designers,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, artists and designers who teach in schools of art and design. That's who tells their stories in the book. But really, it's a book about the stories of professional artists and designers, and they're telling their stories. And in a sense, I'm curating their stories to get at the underlying shared essence across all these different professors. So it's kind of like a universal story
Mm-hmm.
of what's shared between artists and designers who work in these top schools of art and design. I wanted to write a book that they would like, that would resonate with them. So if I did it right, an art professor would read it and say, yeah, that's what we do. He got it right.
Mm-hmm.
But then all the people who are artists and designers who haven't taught in an art school, or maybe who are thinking about teaching a class in an art school and don't know how to do it. My book has the most experienced, most talented professors. I had an average number of years of teaching experience of 20 years.
Wow.
So the people I interviewed were in their 40s and 50s. So yeah, I wanted to write a book for anyone who's interested in the professional process of creating an art and design, because all of these people are successful professional creators. The people who teach at School of Visual Arts in New York are professional artists and designers who are working actively in New York. You don't get hired to teach a class at SVA unless you have a career, a
Mm-hmm.
professional reputation. So really, my book is about the creative process. Now I can use the word creativity. It's about the working process of professional artists and designers, and then, how they teach that. So I don't have anything academic in the book. I don't have any citations. I don't have fancy theories, and I don't talk about grounded theory methodology. I'm really just telling stories for anyone who's interested in how art and design are made and how you can learn how to do it better.
Mm-hmm. I love it. So you distill this research down into 9 themes that are relevant to artists and designers, and I want to touch on 3 of them. So in the chapter on process, which is one of the themes, there's a pair of illustrations by Nyla Smith. Is that how you pronounce her name, Nyla?
That's right. Yeah, Nyla Smith.
So in one illustration, there's a light bulb labeled Big Idea with a straight line to a box that says the created work. So implying that we get this big idea and it just leads right to the creative work, the created work. But in the next image, there's a small light bulb labeled Small Catalyst. And then all these wiggly lines leading to branches of other wiggly lines. And finally, one of those lines connects to a box that says the created work. So tell us a little bit about what those images represent and how they connect to the process that you talk about in the book.
I'm glad you brought that up. The first image is what I claim is a false view of creativity, but it's a very common view. I call it the linear insight view, or I'll call it the linear insight myth. And it's very common that people think creativity comes from having a great idea. And then once you have the great idea, basically your creativity is finished. And the next step is to take that brilliant idea and then to realize it or execute it in whatever your medium is. So if it's painting, you have a brilliant idea and then you use the techniques of painting to paint it.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're an architect, you have a brilliant idea about a new way of thinking about space for a library, and then you go build a model. So it's that linear insight view. I call it linear because it goes straight from having an idea to executing the idea and then to having the product finished at the end. And then, in this mythical view, the product that you have at the end is essentially the same idea you had at the beginning, right? There really wasn't any change along the way. Turns out that is completely false. That's not how, at least creative professionals, people who do this for a living, don't work that way. They work in a more iterative and wandering way that I think of as improvisational, going back to my own studies of jazz and improv theater. But really, it is an improvisational process where you experiment, where you go through many different paths, and critically, you don't know what the end is going to be at the beginning. You have an idea, you have to have an idea of some sort at the beginning, just like a spark to get you going. And so that's what I have at the beginning of Nihilist chart is the small spark. But it's not the whole idea. It's not the finished idea. It's just something to get you started through this improvisational wandering process. And then through that process, you have many, many more small ideas, and the small ideas build off of each other, and it just flows along. Sometimes it reaches a dead end, and then you back up and you restart. It's one of the things that they teach in schools of art and design is that failure is an expected part of the process, and it's not a disaster. There's a way you can take that failure and restart the process by building on what you've learned from the failure. So I have that in Nihilist graph as well, graph chart, where there are dead ends, then you restart. So the second figure that you're describing, it looks kind of like a bush or a
Mm-hmm.
tree, where the bottom of the bush is the initial spark that gets you started. And then there are all the branches, some of which end and don't go anywhere. Those, I guess, are the failures or the dead ends. And then gradually something comes out at the top of the tree, which is the finished creative product. But there are many different branches at the top of the tree, that paths that you might have gone down. All of those different branches might have been the thing that you ended up with. There's never only one way to realize the original spark of the idea that you had, because it's improvisational. It develops through a wandering process. And honestly, that's an important piece of what they're teaching in schools of art and design. And that's why it's the first chapter in the book is called Process, because in a way, that's what it all comes back to, is you are teaching these students to become professional, successful creators. And to do that, they have to master this type of process. And the professors tell me that, the students who start these programs are very talented. You don't get into art school or design school without submitting a portfolio of your past work. So you've been identified as creative in middle school, and you in your high school, you're the one who, makes great looking stuff. Then you apply at the age of 18 to these top art schools that I went to, and you have to submit a portfolio of things that you've made, when you were 16, 17, and 18. So they get to these art schools and they're very talented people. It's not like they don't know anything about painting, but the professors will tell me that when they start, they are working with this linear model of creativity, which is very interesting, right? I mean, these are the most talented, creative high school students who paint, and they are using this linear insight view. And the professors say they're not going to be successful in a creative life if they keep doing that. So they have to teach the students out of that, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. And it's very hard to get someone away from that linear path of working, because once you master it, these 18-year-olds know how to do it. It's very comfortable. You have a certainty, hey, I can have this idea. I can go spend a month painting it and it's going to look great at the end. And it does, because they're talented painters. And it's very comforting because it's certain, it's predictable. But the process that these professors are teaching, you have to have it be unpredictable. You have to not know where it's going to end up. You have to be able to face ambiguity and build on that ambiguity to result in something that you didn't know at the beginning. And even for these very talented 18 and 19-year-olds, they're uncomfortable with doing that. The linear model of creativity is familiar, it's predictable, and it's comforting, and something nice looking comes out at the end. So this is fascinating for people who aren't artists, right? To say, and I asked the professors this, I said, well, if it looks great at the end, why don't you just keep letting them use this linear insight model? And they could tell me in very articulate ways, here's why that's not going to work for these students. The work's not going to be great. And these professional artists in New York City, they can look at a work and they can tell if the creator followed the linear path,
Oh,
which is
absolutely.
fascinating, right? I mean, I can't tell. And that's what it means to know how to see. You can see a work and you can see the process behind it or underneath it. So when you know how to see and you look at a painting or you look at a building, you don't see a static object. You see a dynamic entity, or you see the process that led to it. Everything's in flux and everything's moving, and you can see all the different ways it might have gone. When I go into a museum and I look at a painting, I just see the painting. I don't see that dynamic energy that you do if you know how to see.
I think this is a really important distinction, and I love your phrase, the linear insight myth, because I think that not only do 18-year-old students entering art school believe this is the case, but so do 30, 40, 50-year-olds who are out in the world working professionally, the group of people that I work with. And they think that creativity is that straight line. And then they get really frustrated when they go to start a project and things don't go the way they have it all laid out in the spreadsheet or on the task list. But actually, when you're willing to follow what comes up and be more improvisational and welcome the unpredictability, you end up with something much greater, which is, I think, why the professional artist can look at two pieces of artwork and say, this was done by an 18-year-old, a talented 18-year-old, and this was done by an experienced professional who has really learned to hone in their seeing skills and their creativity skills. And I think it's really important for people to understand, definitely within the art and design world, but even beyond, which is, yeah, I'm going to definitely use this phrase, linear insight myth. And I will credit you, Keith. It's a really cool phrase.
Thank you. Thank you. But you raised an interesting topic when you talked about adults, right? People in their 40s. So I've been talking about 18-year-olds who are starting in a BFA program, but at the School of Visual Art in Manhattan, in New York City, they also have a Master of Fine Arts program. And all of these art and design schools have, the bachelor's and the master's. It's called an MFA. So there are successful professional creatives working full time in Manhattan who have their own creative practice. And sometimes they'll decide to go back to school and get an MFA. So they'll be 35. Oh, and I actually interviewed 10 different MFA students about this process. So, yeah, they're in their late 20s, they're in their 30s. And I interviewed professors who taught those classes as well. And so here's an interesting thing. So you think, what do you have to learn if you've already got a BFA and you have a successful creative practice in Manhattan? What can you learn? Well, several professors, and they're all professional creatives now, the professor and the students who are in their 30s. So they're colleagues in a way, as much as they are teacher and student. This kind of environment, it's an apprenticeship learning environment. But the professors would tell me, for some of these graduate students, it's actually harder than the undergraduates. They have more trouble breaking out of the linear model than
Yep.
the undergraduates. I say, and the reason is because they're successful and they have a successful creative practice, and they've settled into a set of habits of working that they know are going to lead to work that, it's good enough to
Mm-hmm.
satisfy the client. Especially this would be, say, design firms or design consultancies. So they come in at 32 years old and they take their first class in graduate school. And the professors, again, they have to teach them out of the linear way of thinking. And some of the professors I interviewed, they said they get pushback, right? This 32-year-old says, why do I have to do it that way? I'm already good at this other way. So they're used to that. They're expecting that question. And they say, you came back to school to learn something new, right? You could keep doing it your way. You could stay at home and not spend all this money on tuition. But what I'm going to teach you is new ways of seeing and thinking that will help you develop new perspectives on your practice. And that's why it's worth spending the money.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
don't need to spend the money and just keep doing what you're already good at.
Yeah, I love it. All right, so I'm mindful of time, but I would love to just touch on two more themes if we can. So, constraint is another theme in the book. And in my work as an innovation consultant, clients complain about constraints all the time. They say things like, oh, our industry is focused purely on compliance, so we can't innovate. Or we don't have any funding, so we can't implement new ideas. But the reality is that creativity is born out of constraints. And in the book, you talk about the art professors as they're giving assignments to the students. They build a lot of constraints into those assignments. So tell us a little bit about this theme and why this is so important to understand. Why are constraints important?
Two of the chapters in the book, two of the 9 themes, are right next to each other, is constraints and ambiguity. And they're twins, or they're in tension with each other. So professors, when they're teaching these studio classes, they don't give lectures. They have students engage in projects where they are creating something, and it's going to be along the type of process, the iterative wandering process that the professors are trying to teach them. So they say, the professors tell me, ambiguity is an essential part of the process. So they give assignments to the students where there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of things are not specified, which you think, sure, yeah, that's the way art should be. You should be able to do whatever you want. And as a matter of fact, myself, not being an artist and not having any art classes, I thought in 2010, I thought a professor of painting would come in on the first day of the semester and say, this semester, I want you to paint fire. Everyone's going to paint fire. And then in 3 months, come back and show me your fire painting. Yeah, I mean, I've really had this stereotype that you could just do anything you wanted in art school, but absolutely not. And by the way, I interviewed 100 different professors in 22 different art and design disciplines, and they all emphasize the importance of constraints. So you have to have that ambiguity. But the process for the students to get to this personal transformation of learning to see in a new way, they have to be guided by some very highly constrained project assignments. And that really surprised me. I mean, you're learning how to paint and you need constraints. What's going on with that? So I dove in with that. That was such a fascinating finding. And in those 2 chapters, the constraints and the ambiguity chapter, I describe a lot of different project assignments, the exact assignments that these professors use in typeface design and architecture, even in painting and sculpture. There's one class here at my university, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, by a professor, one of my colleagues here, Beth Grabowski, and she was teaching students textiles and fabrics and how to make collages out of different kinds of materials. The 2-week project that started the semester, and she showed me the handout that she gives the students. Here's what you're going to do in the next 2 weeks. It was 2 pages single spaced for a 2-week project. So
Yeah.
that is and it's all, sometimes they call them parameters, not
Mhm.
constraints, but it's a very heavily structured and guided process. That's 2 pages single spaced for 2 weeks of work. So I pressed on that. I said, why? And then I would look at the 2-page handout and I would say, why do you do this one at the bottom of the first page? And they are so articulate, they could tell me exactly why. They say, well, the reason I have that parameter is because 2 years ago I didn't have that parameter, and
Mhm.
and this and the students generated lousy work, and it's because the process wasn't constrained enough. The students need those constraints to master the process, to learn how to see, and then to generate a kind of good quality work that they would not be able to do on their own without the constraints.
Yeah, I love it. And those constraints are very, especially for design students, those constraints mimic what they might see in the, quote unquote real world. But when they're working with a client, they're certainly going to have constraints.
Yeah, you're right. It's not surprising that if you're working in a design consultancy and you sit down with your client and they say, we have an advertising campaign and our brand is this and we need a poster and it has to be whatever 20 by 24 inches. So for a designer, it's easy to see why having a lot of constraints in class would help you be a professional designer. But the same thing happens in the fine art classes,
Yeah.
the painting classes, the sculpture classes, the bookmaking classes. There really is, and this was surprising to me. I didn't expect this. There really is no difference between the fine art classes and the design classes. The fine art classes, the assignments have just as much structure. So I just gave you an example of a textile arts class. They're not designers. It's not a client brief, but it's still 2 pages single spaced of constraints. So it's not only the designers, it's also the artist.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in the book, you describe this very experiential approach that art teachers use to teach the concepts in their classroom, which you just mentioned a few of them. They're not at the front of the room. They're not, clicking through slides saying, "Hey, this is what really good painting looks like and this is what I want you to do in here." Instead, they're guiding the students through this process, and the students learn at this deep level that really helps them embody that learning really at a tacit level, so that it's just in them. It becomes part of them. You said that they're not really learning to see until about year 3 or 4. And even then, they still have a ways to go, even after they graduate. So I'm curious, given what you've observed and learned, how has the research shifted your teaching style, or if at all?
That's a great question because it did. It changed my teaching style dramatically. I started teaching in the 1990s with my PhD in psychology, and I'm teaching classes in psychology and in learning education. And, I taught the same way I learned. I had some lectures, I had small group discussion, I assigned readings, I had students write essays. And I did that in my psychology of creativity class. And I did that for, over 10 years and I got pretty good at it. And I was getting good student course evaluations. I'd get, 4.7 out of 5. But after I started interviewing these professors in 2010, and then I kept going, I interviewed 2011, 2012, 2015. That's one reason I can claim in my book that it really is the underlying essence of all art and design across the United States. Around 2015, I decided I'm going to change the way I teach. I'm going to create project assignments like a 2-week project with a handout that has all the parameters and constraints. And I'm going to have my students engage in this project, but I had to design a project that would lead them to understand my learning outcomes in the psychology of creativity class. I don't need them to learn how to paint or learn how to design a typeface, but I want them to learn the essence of the creative process that's been identified by psychological research. So that was a challenge to use these studio methods to teach a psychological topic. And the first time I did it, it was 2016. And I had 4 different projects that were 2 weeks each. And I got the worst course evaluations of my entire life. I've been getting, 4.7 out of 5. And I taught with the studio method. And I think I got 3.1
Oh,
out of
wow.
5. It just did not work. But the professors who've been doing this for their whole lives, so they laughed and they said, yeah, that's what happened with me too. And, keep in mind that these are the best professors in the country with 20
Right.
years experience. But they would say the first 2 years I taught, I was horrible. I got the worst evaluations. It's really hard to teach the way they teach. And that's, frankly, that's one reason my book is so compelling and why I hope everyone who's an educator, I hope, will read my book, because it helps you understand what you need to do to teach people a deep understanding of how to see and think. But it also helps you realize that it's hard and that it's going to be effortful, and you're going to make mistakes when you try to learn to teach in this new way. So that was my first time in 2016, and then I iterated and I revised and I modified my 4 project assignments, and I've gotten to the point where I think it works and I get good course evaluations. But it really was reinventing my way of teaching.
I love this. Okay, Keith, I'm going to give you a constraint. And when I answer this next question in one sentence, given everything you just said, everything you learned in this book, what is a one sentence piece of advice you have for other college professors who might want to explore teaching in a new way and move away from that lecture based style? One sentence.
Give your students the opportunity to experiment and explore and make mistakes.
Love it. Awesome. So, as we close here, can you give the listeners some practical advice that they can start applying right away? What can listeners do this week?
To learn how to see, you have to practice seeing in a new way. So, my advice is to go through your day, and anyone can do this, all sorts of exercises that help you see in a new way. I'll ask my students to do this. For example, I'll say, when you're leaving class today and you're walking to your next class, look up at the top of the buildings that you're passing, the other buildings on campus. Look up at the tops of buildings and find something that you don't understand why it's there. And there's always something. There's
Right.
always something odd on top of a building. But students don't look up. People don't look up. And frankly, my students are texting on their phones while they're walking. I don't know how they do it. But yeah, put your phone away. Look somewhere where you don't normally look. So that's actually a constraint, right? The
Mm-hmm.
constraint is look up, look at the tops of buildings. If I just said, go look at something, that's unconstrained. But then what are you going to do? What do you mean, look at something? But having that specific parameter or constraint, find something at the top of a building and you're not sure why it's there. That kind of constraint is the sort of things you're going to see in art and design school. And I don't know, forces might be too extreme a word, but it guides you to look. And if you keep doing that every day, you take a different constraint like that. And I have these actually on my creativity card deck, the zigzag creativity cards. Some of the cards are these activities. You can take a card in the morning, and one of them will say, for example, look up at the tops of buildings and identify something new and surprising and different. And Amy, I actually got this idea from you. You have your own creativity card deck, which is very impressive. And I saw your deck and I thought, you know what? I could do a creativity card deck, my zigzag creativity cards. So anyway, that's
Which
a
are
long
excellent. Yeah, they're
answer.
great.
Long answer to your question, but yes, look up at the tops of buildings and find something you're not sure why it's there, and then ask the question, why is it there?
I love it. So now, Keith, I know this is your podcast, but I still think it's worth asking this question. Is that where can listeners learn more about you and your work?
Please visit my website at keithsawyer.com. And I really hope that you'll take a look at my new book called Learning to See Inside the World's Leading Art and Design Schools.
Yes, awesome. I definitely recommend the book. I have read it. It is compelling. The first time I started reading it, I was frustrated that I had to put it down to go take care of something else. But I was getting sucked in, and there's a lot of great ideas. I love the way you have chunked things in these 9 themes. I think it's very effective as a reader to be able to digest it in that way. And highly recommend the book, whether you're an artist or a designer, or you're somebody who just wants to be more creative. It's a really good book. So check out Learning to See. And Keith, thank you so much for having me on the show to interview you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I'm so delighted that you were willing to do this, and we've had a great conversation.
Absolutely.
Amy was one of the first people I know who started a podcast about creativity. Hers is called The Deliberate Creative. She had me on her show all the way back in 2016. And that's why I invited her to join me for this conversation about my new book, Learning to See Inside the World's Leading Art and Design Schools. I can't stop talking about the book. And of course, my name's on the cover, but I'm really just telling the stories of these brilliant artists and designers. They've mastered the ability to teach others how to create at the highest levels of art and design. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're interested in art and design and what happens in BFA and MFA programs, please take a look at the book's website, learningtosee.net. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.